Montana, the Treasure State. Admitted into the Union on November 8, 1889. Montana's history is long and full of incredible tales. Its history within the United States began on April 30, 1803, with the signing of the Treaty of the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase was a massive section of land that encompassed most of the American Midwest. It stretched from the Gulf of Mexico in the south to Canada in the north. It was sold to the United States by the French for just $15 million. Flowing right through the heart of the Louisiana Purchase is the mighty Missouri River. In 1804, the now famous explorers Lewis and Clark had ventured up the Missouri River, across the Great Plains and over the Rocky Mountains to reach the Pacific Ocean. During the winter of 1804, Lewis and Clark set up a camp near a Native American village just east of what is now the border between Montana and North Dakota. There they studied the geology, the terrain, the river system, and the native Mandan people, who were the people who lived in the village nearby. Then in the summer of 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition discovered the headwaters of the Missouri River, right in the center of what is now Montana. This location was a pivotal point within their expedition. Now it is a city known as Three Forks. Its name came from the point of convergence between the Missouri River and three other rivers, the Madison, the Jefferson, and the Gallatin. From here, they decided to venture down the Jefferson River, which eventually led them to the Salmon and Columbia Rivers and then to the Pacific. During their return journey, the Lewis and Clark expedition split into two different parties. They would eventually reunite at the meeting point between the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers, near what is now the Fort Buford historical site on the border between Montana and North Dakota. In total, Lewis and Clark spent more time in Montana than any other state within the Union. The first permanent American settlement in Montana was in 1841. A Jesuit father named Pierre Jean de Smet and several other missionaries had built the St. Mary's Mission near the Bitterroot Mountains. Their purpose was to introduce Christian teachings, animal husbandry, and farming to the native Salish people who lived in the area. The mission was a complex of buildings, including a chapel, a pharmacy known as Father Rivali's cabin, and another cabin built for the Salish chieftain, Chief Victor. The Salish people embraced the Jesuits' Christian values, many of which corresponded with their own, such as community obedience, respect for family, and burying their dead. However, the Salish people did not embrace the Jesuits' political or economic views, which did give challenge to their ideals. But despite the differences, it was quite a peaceful community. But as the years went on, that changed. In 1846, a larger church was being constructed, but before its completion, raids by the Salish people's enemies, the Blackfeet, forced the Jesuits to not only stop construction, but also temporarily close the mission. Then, in 1850, the constant raids by the Blackfeet, along with their considered unusual practices, forced the Jesuits to burn down the church in fear of its desecration. They would then sell the mission to a local trader named John Owen for just $250. But in 1866, the church was rebuilt and the mission was reestablished. But just 6 years later, in 1872, the U.S. government forced the Salish people to leave their homeland and live in the Flathead Reservation in the north. The Jesuits, who formed a strong bond with the Salish people, advocated for them by writing letters to the U.S. government, demanding their relocation back to the Bitterroot Valley. But unfortunately, it was with no avail. By 1891, virtually all the Salish people were forced to live in the reservation. Today, the St. Mary's Mission still stands and is now a National Historic Landmark. It is a reminder of the nation's once troubled times, but it is also proof that even in a land full of discrimination, coexistence was possible. Today, the mission is labeled as the place where Montana began. One of the missionaries who helped re-establish the mission in 1866 was the Italian-born and extraordinarily skilled Father Antonio Ravalli. Father Ravalli was an educated physician, surgeon, and pharmacist. He was known for regularly riding his pony throughout the countryside where he would assist the sick and injured. Upon his arrival at St. Mary's Mission, he would inoculate the Salish people against the deadly smallpox virus. But he was more than just a kind-hearted doctor. He was also an artist, a sculptor, an architect, a carpenter, and a botanist. He had built Montana's first sawmill, as well as its first grist mill for processing wheat. He quickly became a fabled figure. And today there is a town and a county within Montana that share his name. Native American peoples had lived in the area of what would become Montana for over 12,000 years. While not entirely known, it is suggested that in 1800, the population of natives ranged from 600,000 to 1.5 million. But due to the arrival of European settlers who brought diseases as well as warfare, that number quickly declined. By 1870, the native population was estimated at just a little over 19,000. During the early 1800s, there were numerous tribes throughout the area, but with enforcement of reservations by Americans and the massive amount of casualties suffered during the American Indian Wars, many tribes were either relocated or completely eradicated. Today, there are only 12 recognized tribes within Montana: the Kootenai, Blackfeet, Salish, Chippewa, the Little Shell Chippewa, Plains Cree, Pandore, Gros Ventre, Sioux, Assiniboine, Northern Cheyenne, and the Crow. One of the most infamous events that occurred in Montana was that of the battle at Little Bighorn in 1876, where 211 American men led by General George Custer were massacred by over 2,000 Cheyenne and Lakota warriors, led by Sitting Bull. The exact number of battles fought between the native tribes and American settlers is not fully known, but it's estimated that between the start of the American Indian Wars in 1609 to the end in 1900, over 4 million natives were killed. Other well-known battles in Montana were the Battle of the Big Hole in the Bitterroot Mountains and the Battle of Bear Paw, where the Nez Perce natives were led by the now famous Chief Joseph. Possibly one of the most famous Montana-born natives was Charlo, the peaceful Salish leader who defended his people against the tyranny of the American settlers and fought for their independence and equality. When the U.S. government forced his people to leave their land, he worked hard on negotiating with the U.S. government on supplying farm goods, as well as the right to continue to hunt buffalo. In 1872, after President Ulysses S. Grant ordered the Salish people to leave their valley, Congressman James Garfield arrived to enforce the order. This nearly led to a fight, but Charlo used his diplomatic skills to quickly de-escalate the situation. Garfield then proposed a written agreement to Charlo. Part of the tribe would relocate to the Flathead Reservation, while the other half would remain. Charlo refused to sign this agreement. He felt as if it was unfair to his people. Unfortunately, the U.S. government would take no firm answer. They would end up using another Salish leader to fake Charlo's signature to carry out with the order. But Charlo refused to leave and continued to stay within the valley with the remaining half of his people. In 1876, a newspaper printed a speech written by Charlo. It addressed feeling of betrayal by the other Salish leader and his frustration towards the U.S. government who harmed his people and broke their promises. Charlo continued to fight for the rights of his people until his death in 1910. The town of Charlo near Flathead Lake and the Chief Charlo Elementary School in Missoula were named in his honor. Montana is a wild and raw place. The terrain, the wildlife, its vast and isolated areas, and the extreme weather conditions, particularly in the winter, make Montana one of the most challenging states for people to live in, even by today's standards. The 19th century lifestyle in Montana's rugged expanse demanded a sense of toughness and preparedness of anyone who lived there. But even the most prepared and skilled person can face hardship. In the fall of 1870, Truman Everts, a member of an expedition exploring what would eventually become Yellowstone National Park, became separated from the main expedition party, lost his pack horse, and found himself in a life-threatening situation. After a few days, Everts began to suffer from hallucinations, starvation, and frostbite, but he persevered. He was able to stay alive by eating thistles and lighting fires using a piece of opera glass. He fought through snowstorms, encounters with dangerous wildlife, and injuries from burning himself. Finally, after 37 long and perilous days, Everts was rescued. He was found 50 miles from his last known location. He was found mumbling and delirious and near death. Everts had lost around 90 pounds and was covered in other injuries from his ordeal. But he survived and would later write about his experience in a short novel titled 37 Days of Peril. Possibly the most well-known tale of survival in Montana was that of the highly skilled trapper and frontiersman Hugh Glass. In 1823, Glass was part of a large hunting party when one day while hunting alone, he was brutally attacked by a grizzly bear. Glass had survived the attack, but his wounds were so severe that he could not move or speak. He was very near death, but the worst was yet to come. Fearing the hostile natives that lived in the area, and believing that he was going to die anyway, the other members of the hunting party abandoned him to die in the middle of the vast and harsh wilderness, but not before raiding his belongings and taking his supplies. Remarkably, Glass, who was a highly skilled and experienced frontiersman and now fueled by vengeance, managed to find the strength to begin to crawl through the snow and ice to find his way back to the nearest fort. For the next 6 long, agonizing weeks, Glass slowly crawled across the wilderness, evading the hostile natives and dangerous predators. Though the attack occurred in what is now South Dakota, his path back to civilization was across what is now central Montana. Eventually, he came across the Missouri River and, despite the frigid temperatures, made a small makeshift raft and floated over 100 miles back to Fort Kiowa, the fort where the hunting party first set off. John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger, the two men who were responsible for taking his supplies and leaving him for dead, were in Glass's sights. But unfortunately for Glass, when he arrived at the fort, they were gone. After weeks of healing from his wounds, incredibly, Glass set off back into the wilderness to track them down and murder them. After reaching the Missouri once again, Glass crossed paths with a small group of Canadian explorers. Together, they floated upstream on rafts. But after 6 long weeks and several hundreds of miles, they were attacked by the native Arikara's people. Every one of the explorers was killed except for one, Glass. Glass had once again overcome terrible odds and was still on his path to revenge. Glass did eventually find John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger, but it had been nearly a year since they had abandoned him, and in that time, Fitzgerald had joined the army. Glass was opposed to killing a soldier. He knew if he did, he would have been executed. So Glass decided to spare his life and forgive him, but not before taking back his rifle that he had stolen from him. Glass also spared Jim Bridger's life. He had realized that Bridger was young and was only doing what Fitzgerald had asked him to do. Sadly, Glass was killed in 1833 in an attack by native tribes while on the Yellowstone River. But his legend continued to live on, and still lives on today. His amazing story of survival and revenge has inspired many novels and even films. Hugh Glass and Truman Everts were two people who managed to find the endurance and will to survive whatever conditions Montana had to offer. But it was not just individuals who have suffered. The winter of 1886 and 87 was considered by many the worst winter in Montana's history. The extreme cold and endless snowfall and storms led to the deaths of dozens of people and thousands of livestock. Due to the massive loss of life, this winter very nearly ended the entire cattle industry, leading ranchers to drastically change their methods for the future. This winter is now known as the hard winter, and it's a reminder of the more extreme side of Montana.